Okay, looks like the number of participants has stabilized, so I think we should probably get going. Thank you everyone for joining our most recent talk in the CHM Seminar Series. There will be more of those going forward, and I hope it'll be a nice venue for us to learn about exciting new work, both outside of the Institute as well as from within the Institute. And I should also say that if you have work that you think you would like to present, if any of you have work that you'd like to present that's relevant, feel free to come forward and make a suggestion. We could find a slot for you to present. The important thing is just for us to have an interesting chat about exciting new research. I want to thank first Nils for agreeing to speak today. Nils just joined the Institute and CHM last month as a postdoc, and he brings in he came from, well, he's German, but he spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, and over there he worked, I think your PhD was in psychology, Nils, is that right? So he's got a background in psychology, but he's also worked in an economics department. So he absorbed a little bit of the behavioral economics way of doing things, which cares about incentivizing experiments and so on. And now he's here, hopefully bringing in more computational perspective as well. Just as a backdrop, I wanted to kind of say why I really like this work, which Nils did before coming here. It's because a lot of behavioral scientists are interested in questions related to AI, and a lot of it is a lot of what they do, and including a lot of the work that I've done myself, is asking people to make judgments about hypothetical things that machines might do. So you could imagine a machine doing something, and then you would be asked, what do you think of that? And that can be useful, especially if the machines don't exist yet. That's the only thing you could do. For example, a self-driving car doesn't exist yet, so it's really hard to ask people about scenarios without having them imagine. And in many cases, we have machines that can do the things that we care about, and it would be it would be a waste not to have people deal with actual AI algorithms. And that's what Nils has tried to do. He's done the harder part. I think a lot of research just basically would generate a decision and then would say, would trick some people into thinking this is done by a machine, and then would see whether people trust it more or trust it less, and so on. I think there are more rare cases of research projects that have people interact with real algorithms. And I think that's what makes it exciting, and hopefully we'll do more of this type of research with Nils going forward. So with that, I'll leave it to Nils also to explore the really nice title that he's come up for his paper. The floor is yours, Nils. And Nils, would you like people to ask questions during the talk or after?
Both is fine. So, I mean, if people have a comprehension question or a comment during the talk, I'm very happy for them to unmute themselves and just chime in. It's totally fine.
Great. Yeah, I think it's more fun if these things are done a little bit like a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's already drier than if I had the opportunity to give this talk in person. I think we could make it even more interactive. So by any means possible, let's try to make it as engaging as possible.
I agree. I think also it's with so many talks you can now attend online, the real value of showing up synchronously is to be able to have a conversation. So
absolutely,
let's take advantage of that. Okay, thanks, Nils. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, thank you, Iyad, for this great introduction, for the opportunity to give this short talk on some work that indeed it started when I was at the Department of Economics at the University of Amsterdam, more specifically at the Center for Experimental Economics and Political Decision Making. It's called CREED. And as Iyad has sort of alluded to already, it's a behavioral econ department. And so the two things that Iyad just mentioned were basically off the table, namely using hypothetical scenarios, which economists do not really believe in, and tricking people into believing that, you know, a certain stimulus actually comes from an algorithm, whereas in fact it was a human stimulus, which they would call deception and is like verboten by any means. So we were basically starting this work, which is joint work, I should say, with a former master student of mine, Luca Mossink, who is now at the Dutch Central Bank Innovation Lab. It started off by us sitting down in my office and thinking about how we could do research that basically has, let's say, the overarching title of Behavioral Economics of Artificial Intelligence. Right, so bringing the two together, because I was fascinated by the topic of artificial intelligence, and I pitched it to the cohort of students, and I had several ones coming to my office asking me if we could write or if they could write their thesis with me. And with Luca, I started thinking about what is already out there when it comes to behavioral economics, basically studying artificial intelligence. And except for very few papers, a seminal work by Crandall and colleagues, there was really not a lot. And I think in part that has to do with exactly the challenges that Iyad mentioned. It's not that easy to do, which I will come back later. Having said that, at the same time, there was basically the release of the natural language generation algorithm GPT-2, which I guess most of you know already. It was released by OpenAI, and it was accompanied by a lot of media attention. Initially, there was only a smaller version of this algorithm released because it was allegedly too dangerous to release because it could create human-like text. So it was alleged. At close to zero marginal cost. It was openly accessible. And what is more remarkable about this algorithm is that it's relatively robust across different text writing domains. So with a little bit of transfer learning, you can actually let it craft poems, summarize text, translate text, write blog posts. And as we will come back later, actually you also write student essays. So there was some concern about this algorithm. It was the first algorithm to be interviewed by The Economist, also making a lot of waves due to that. And I guess by now you might have also heard about its predecessor, about its following model, the GPT-3, which wrote much, let's say, discussed op-ed in The Guardian entitled, "A Robot Wrote This Entire Article, Are You Scared Yet Human?" So needless to say, there was a lot of attention already being placed on this algorithm. At the same time, when looking through the research that had been done at the point, we couldn't really find anything in the realms of behavioral economics, meaning we couldn't really find any studies using incentivized measures, using this algorithm in a behavioral context. So we started off by drafting some research ideas we might want to address. So the very first one that we thought about was inspired by another economics question. Basically, is there even a demand for such text output? What I mean by that is, do people find it actually appealing? Do people find, for example, non-fiction text that this algorithm would spit out, do they actually like it? Do they find it more or less appealing than text that humans would write in a similar domain? And this was sort of inspired by this newspaper article in the New York Times showing that already novelists are making use of similar algorithms to help them basically deal with the writer's block. So whenever they feel like they don't know where the text should go, they could let the algorithm spit out a few sentences. And at times, at least according to this article, this is quite useful, and it helps them to basically overcome whenever they feel like they're out of ideas. So in a very broad and first question that we wanted to address is here really, how does this algorithm compare to human writers? A second question that was sort of related to that is, how does knowing about the source of the text, so whether the text was written by a human or an AI, shape people's preferences? And this is in part inspired by a lot of attention that is being placed on transparency. So transparency is one of the key pillars of, for example, the fairness, accountability, transparency framework, which argues that these are the main pillars to ensure that AI remains ethical and aligned with human values. At least it helps for sure to inform people when they are dealing with algorithms, which is called algorithmic presence. And given, for example, the advances in deepfakes, many of you might have heard of Google Duplex, this hyper-realistic phone agent. There has been a discussion whether it should be mandatory for algorithms to disclose themselves, right? So whenever you would, for example, get a phone call that is actually not a human, but an AI, it should basically say, look, you're not dealing with a human, but you're dealing with an AI. In line with that, we wanted to see, well, what effect does it have when people know that the text was written by an AI? And we know from other research that people have, when they have to answer in hypothetical scenarios, an aversion to algorithms making decisions, especially for emotional domains. And you can make an argument that writing creative text, and especially poetry, is something that is emotionally charged. So people might actually be reluctant or somewhat aversive towards the text outputs of the algorithm when they know that it was written by an AI. So this is something that we tested in one between subjects treatment. Now, the third question is maybe the one that initially got us most interested in this whole project. And that is basically, well, you see everywhere in the news that this algorithm could create human-like text, but we could actually not find any sound evidence for it. And what do I mean by sound evidence? Has to do with the role of incentives that Yad already mentioned. So we did a systematic search and we could not find any study that used the Turing test or a version of a Turing test with actual financial incentives. So to some extent, it remained unclear whether people who could not tell apart AI from human would just not be motivated to do it, or whether they couldn't do it. So whether it's a matter of ability or motivation. So we thought, why don't we design a test where we can introduce financial incentives and thereby sort of also satisfy the behavioral econ standards of establishing whether people can actually tell it apart. How we did that, I will show you in just a second. We first finally, related to that third question, show you the last main research question that we tried to address in this project, and that is, well, how confident are people in their abilities to detect the algorithm? It might be problematic if, for example, people think that they can tell it apart, but they actually can't. So if they show some sign of overconfidence. So in these studies, we assessed how confident they actually were in their abilities to tell apart human from AI written text. And we did so in 2 experiments, drawing on a total number of 830 participants. They were pre-registered, and the materials, data, and R code are openly available. And I'm really happy for you to comment also on that, or if you want to make use of the stimuli that I will show you in just a moment. So how did we do that? I have to tell you that basically the study consists of 4 main parts. The first part is actually not that easy. It's about how do we actually select the stimulus material. We decided to go into the domain of poetry writing for 2 main reasons. For one, poetry is relatively short. Therefore, it is quite easy to let a human write such a text. At the same time, it has long been considered sort of a stronghold of human capacities or capabilities, that something that is sort of impregnable for artificial intelligence. We will come back to the discussion whether this is indeed the case later on, but for now it was sort of, let's say, an easy type of text to run this experiment on. We hope that other texts will soon follow suit and sort of use a similar approach. For now, what we did was basically use 2 starting line of a poem, and we gave these 2 starting lines, the exact same 2 starting lines, to either a human writer or GPT-2. And these 2 starting lines were, in study 1, the lessons of our time preach the uneventfulness. And from the human side, we basically recruited, from the machine side, we basically used the medium model of GPT-2, the only one that was available at the time, that was trained on other poems, for example, by Jane Campion, Roald Dahl, Robert Frost, and other sort of established poets. And we basically handpicked the best outputs that GPT-2 produced based on these 2 starting lines. That's sort of the AI competitor, if you will. On the other side of the competition, we recruited human writers on Prolific, and we advertised it as a study on creative writing, and gave them these 2 starting lines and asked them to write at least 8 lines of poetry. And they had several rules to adhere to, that they couldn't write any gibberish, they couldn't address the judge, which I will come to in just a second. They couldn't plagiarize, and we basically gave them financial rewards for competing against the AI. How did they compete? Well, after having written these texts, we recruited a separate sample of judges, also via Prolific, and told them, look, it's your job to read always pairs of poems and award a winner. Okay, so they basically received 10 pairs of poems and always had to pick a winner for each round. They knew that this had financial consequences, so they knew that the one that they picked will receive financial rewards. And that's a bit of an econ concern to reduce efficiency concern, namely that people might always want to select the human. We told them that if they pick the GPT-2 written poem, some randomly chosen other writer would get the reward. Okay, so basically the idea is we wanted to avoid that people always try to reward the human because they think, well, if I pick GPT-2, then this money is basically lost. So we try to avoid that from happening by having a so-called token player that gets the reward when they pick the AI written poem as a winner. So they could choose for every round, which poem they like better, the human written one or the AI written one. Now,
can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, I was thinking like for this study one here, why can't you just tell the human judge that both of the poetry are from human beings, so they don't know it is one is from human and the other is GPT-2?
Yeah, that is sort of in line with this argument I made earlier. That would violate the standards of no deception policy, right? Because you would have effectively lying to people.
Okay, that makes sense.
If I may jump here, I should say, Jason, that this is a contentious area. So
yeah.
broadly speaking, economists are against deception completely, and they have a number of arguments against it, mostly that when you deceive people, then people will be less trusting of future experimenters. So you're kind of contaminating the subject pool. Okay. That's kind of a main argument. Yeah. In psychology, it's a little bit less of a concern. But there are labs that are also against deception unless there is a strong need for it. For example, the ARC Research Center, Adaptive Rationality, here at the Institute, they're very much against deception by default unless there's a strong reason. But yeah, that's, of course, in my own work, we have done this kind of thing, like where we told people they were interacting with a human, we told them it was a bot and vice versa. But that paper would never pass review in an economics journal, and we don't have a co-author who's an economist either on that paper.
And it's interesting
Thank you.
That you mentioned that, Jason, because this was also the question that we got from one of the reviewers. And it's a journal within psychology, so Computers and Human Behavior is a sort of psych journal. And the reviewer asked us, why didn't you just do that? And we basically, again, coming from this econ background, we wouldn't have been able to get funding for this study if we used deception, just like sort of pragmatically, we wouldn't be able to do that. We weren't able to do that when I was still at the UFA. But at the same time, it was kind of an interesting rebuttal that we had to write, basically convincing our reviewer why it made sense not to deceive. And in fact, what Iyad said is also in line with the APA rules. So the American Psychological Association, they have guidelines when to use deception, and they say only if it is really, really, really necessary. Another argument why not using deception here is that we're also interested in the performance of the algorithm. So we actually wanted to also find out how well the algorithm actually performs. And so we decided against it. But it's indeed a contentious debate, and we could go, I think we can also discuss it later, what the benefits and the downsides are. For now, I hope it's clear that we basically have the setup. We have human writers recruited on Prolific. We have GPT-2 medium model. They both get the same two starting lines. They spit out text. And then we basically put these texts always in pairs and ask human judges to make a judgment about which one they like more, a judgment that had financial consequences. Now, the way it looks like, going back to what I mentioned about the information, we had two different treatments. as to how much information these judges got. So in our information treatment opacity, they only knew that one of the texts was written by an AI and the other one was written by a human, but they didn't know which one. So it would look something like this. It would have these two texts. So here, one text would say the lessons of our time, preach the uneventfulness of human nature, like a voice from a distant wilderness, whistling on the desert lips of a people long since departed. Preach patience. Let's not rush to judgment. Let us make right decisions with calmness, tranquility. And the other poem would say, the lessons of our time, preach the uneventfulness of the most significant events, while squandering our attention on blank and desperate nothingness. Why do you look at the screen when all the world contains wonders that pass you by in violent whispers? Now they had to decide which one they liked more, not knowing who, like basically which one was written by a human, which one was written by an AI. And we contrasted that to a second treatment, which is called the transparency treatment. And there they knew that, for example, the first poem in this case was written by an AI. And they knew that the second poem was written by a human, and they could decide which one they liked more. So they could, for example, in this case, award the human. And they did that 10 rounds. Okay, so basically we have a bit more information about also sort of judges' preferences, right? So it might be that some judges just have strong preference for human, and while others may be in favor of the AI. Now the question is, when we are looking at what economists would call revealed preferences, right? We don't ask them for their hypothetical, what would you like more? We ask them actually, which one do you like more? And it has financial consequences. We wanted to see what we find in these different treatments. So here is basically what we find in the opacity treatment. So where they don't know who wrote these poems, we do find a preference for the human written poem, because above the dashed line basically means a preference for the human. Below the dashed lines means a preference for the AI. Now, if we would find what the literature on algorithm aversion suggests, then we should actually find in the transparency treatment the preference should go higher up, so should be even stronger towards humans. If the opposite is true, then we should basically find that people on average have a preference for the AI written poem. What we did find is, in fact, quite a strong null result, right? So we basically find that there are no treatment differences. So people do not seem to prefer human written poems more strongly when they know that it was written by a human. It's pretty much the same. And this is basically the same result whether we are using Bayesian analysis or probability regression. So it's quite robustly a null effect of no effect of this information being provided. This basically informs us about the preferences. And again, it's a revealed preferences, meaning this is actually what people prefer, not what they say they would prefer. As I said, the study has 3 parts. So we're now moving to the third part, which is the detection accuracy.
Question?
Yeah, please. Yes, please.
It's a very subjective question, actually. Is it possible to say why, like, the humans prefer? I mean, in terms of, is it possible, for example, to have a measure of how well the algorithm is performing, or how good is it creating, just to make, of course, the algorithm is bad. Of course, the human being will always win, right? So is it possible to know why this is? I don't know if has a question for that. Thank you.
It's a great question, Leonardo. Is it okay for you if I park it? Because I think we have an answer in study 2. And if you feel like I haven't answered it in study 2, please ask it again and I will come back.
Sure,
we dealt with that a little bit in study 2.
Of course. Thank you.
Cool,
so I also have a clarification question. So here, when you say a pair of the poetry, then you ask a human judge to read. How many judges you use for one pair?
We have, so basically we randomly matched these pairs, right? So we had 10 pairs, and for each pair, we had at least 20 observations.
So do you see like they are agreeing with each other for like 20 different human judges?
You mean like how much agreement there is, which pairs are
better?
Yeah. I would have to double check that. I do think we have quite some convergence. So we do, for example, have some pairs where there are stronger preferences towards humans and vice versa. The main finding here overall is that it seems to cancel each other out. And we did random matching of these pairs. So it's not like we picked the ones where we feel like, oh, here the AI has the best chance to win. Let's pair that with a very bad human poem. We actually made these pairings completely random. But it might be interesting to look at sort of what are the criteria or qualities of a AI poem that seem to be very difficult or very appealing to people, let's say, right?
Thank you.
Right. So this is all about still preferences, right? I mean, the third part of the study was all about the detection accuracy, and here we did what I mentioned earlier. We used this sort of version of a Turing test in which we introduced incentives. So I mean, I guess you all know the classic Turing test, where people typically have a conversation with two agents and have to tell which one is a human and which one is an AI. We did not have such a conversation in our study. We just gave them the two texts and asked people to indicate which one they thought was written by a human and which one they thought was written by an AI. And we gave them financial incentives for accuracy, so they could earn €0.50 if they were accurate. Now, for those of you who are on Twitter and who follow the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, you might have seen actually our stimulus material there a few days ago. So this is really how it looked like in the experiment. They had to say which of the two poems was written by a human and which one was written by an AI. I give you a few seconds. I don't want to bore you with my bad intonation of poems, so you can read through both of them and make up your mind which one you think was written by an AI. Give you a few seconds for that. All right, so after participants had read both of these poems, we asked them also for their confidence. And in study one, we just asked them, how confident are you about your judgment? And I could ask you the same thing, right? Like on a scale from 100 to 0, how confident are you that you know which one was written by an AI? And basically, based on that, we wanted to see whether people are accurate in their estimation. So what do we find? First, I want to show you which of the two poems was actually written by an AI. In this case, it was the one to the right, while the left one was written by Shil Silverstein. So what do we find when it comes to detection accuracy? Well, on average, over or across basically all of these pairs, people have an accuracy of 50.21%. And this one you can shake and analyze in all different ways. It basically indicates that people are not better than guessing in detecting the AI written poems, which to us was exactly what we predicted. And it's sort of in line with this notion that AI can write human-like text by now. It's at the same time still somewhat, I mean, I was a bit amazed when I found it, how spot on a random guessing this estimate was. Now, the question that we explored, and I have to note that this was not pre-registered, was how does this link to confidence? And overall, we wanted to look at what is the distribution of confidence, and we find that it is left skewed, which is a sort of first indication of overconfidence. So overall, on average, people actually were more confident than average, although they guessed with average accuracy. And therefore, we also correlated and regressed whether their confidence level, self-reported, correlates with their accuracy levels. And here we find a very flat line. So it indicates that there is no relationship between people's confidence and their ability to detect the AI poem. And it's an indication, I could say, of overconfidence. Having said that, I have to note again, this was something that we kind of found interesting and started exploring. So let me wrap up the results
Nils?
of study one. Yes.
This is Jason.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a stupid methodological question here. So if you had given 10 points, well, a scale of 10, you wouldn't have seen these sort of diagrams, right? It would be much more coarse-grained, I assume. That's why
absolutely.
you got the 100. Okay.
No, it's really good that you asked that question, because I gave this talk when I was applying for the job here at the Max Planck Institute, and that was when we had study 1 done and we had to do the revision for the second study, and I was talking to Nicolo about it, and he gave a suggestion how we could do it better in the second study. So I think the way we do it in study 2 hopefully satisfies your concern, because I mean I am aware that this 0 to 100 measure of confidence is not ideal.
No, it's a lot for a human being, but I think it's done methodologically.
Great. All right, so I'll briefly want to outline sort of what we found in study 1 and then move to study 2, because I think both Jason and Leonardo's concerns are hopefully addressed in it. So what do we find in study 1? We do find a slight preference for human written poems over GPT-2 poems. We do find no treatment differences when it comes to the provision of information. So it doesn't seem to matter whether people know who wrote these poems, whether this particular one was written by a human and another one by an AI or not. And when it comes to the detection accuracy, it basically was at chance levels. And we do find, again, I have to be a bit careful here, we do find first signs of overconfidence. Having said all of that, there were several limitations of this with this first study. Some of them were already mentioned. One, for example, is we had these novices, people that are not trained creative writers, having to write a poem. At the same time, we handpicked the outputs of GPT-2, so people could say, you stack the cards against the human, right? And that's indeed, I think, a fair criticism. And then also we had this Turing test that I just showed you about the accuracy. We could only do it in the subgroup of people in the opacity treatment, because obviously if you're in the transparency treatment, you know which poem was written by a human and which one was written by an AI. You cannot be asked to guess, right? It's just logically impossible. But at the same time, we might have underestimated the effect because the sample was relatively small. And then sort of going back to Jason's point, well, not exactly that point, but it relates to that, namely the measure of confidence might have not been ideal. And I think there are two main criticisms. The first one, it's possibly difficult for people to estimate their confidence from 0 to 100. Also, what does 50 actually mean, right? Does 50 mean you're sort of guessing? What does 0 then mean? 0 means you don't know at all. You're 100% sure that you're going to guess the wrong one, right? So there might be different interpretations of this 0 to 100 scale. So furthermore, if we want to talk about the difference between hypothetical preferences and revealed preferences, then maybe it makes sense to also assess hypothetical preferences. We don't know how people say they feel about AI writing poetry. Okay, so we addressed these points with the following methodological changes in study 2. So for one, we did not recruit novices as writers, but we actually used existing professional poems by established poets, such as Maya Angelou, who I very much admire. So that's why we named the paper sort of after her. And basically used these actual poems and compared them with output from GPT-2. Then we actually also addressed that point with the hand selection. And I think that's a point that I will come back to in just a moment. Namely, we had a between subjects treatment where in one treatment, we again handpicked the best outputs of GPT-2. And in the other treatment, we just randomly used whatever GPT-2 spit out. And I'll show you why this might be relevant also moving forward when trying to use real algorithms in experiments. We also recruited a separate sample of participants to do the Turing test with. And we used the incentivized confidence measure. And the way we did it is indeed a 10-point scale. We gave them 10 rounds, right? So we could tell them after they are done with the Turing test, we ask them, okay, you have now compared 10 pairs. For how many do you think you were accurate, right? And if they were correct about that guess, they could earn extra money. So there was an incentivized measure of their confidence level in their detection accuracy. And finally, we also included a measure of stated preferences towards AI writing poetry. And that was really simple. We used an existing scale that measures algorithm aversion that basically looks like this. Oh, wait, sorry, I'm just going to skip that. Oh, wait, I'll come back to that in just a second, sorry. I'll show you this algorithm aversion in just a second. So first, I want to show you how we selected the poems. So again, we basically, like I said, we used the GPT-2 model. And this time we used the full model, not the medium model. We again trained it on existing poems, and we gave it the same 2 starting lines of professional poems that we included. So for example, if there was a poem by Maya Angelou, we used these 2 starting lines and let AI basically write an alternative ending to this poem. And compared that to the original, right? So if anything, I think we sort of stacked the cards slightly against the algorithm in the second study. Because we basically had by now prolific writers, those were not untrained novices, but actual poets. And because people might know these poems, we ask them both for whether they know it, just yes, no, and then ask them, okay, if you know this poem, please write down the name of the poet who wrote it, and could check for that in the analysis later on. So this is basically, again, part 1, just selecting the poems. We're not done with that yet, because in part 1, we also introduced this new treatment that I mentioned. What do we do in the 1 form is basically exactly what we did in study 1, namely we handpick the best outputs, which is, you could argue, a form of human being in the loop, in the decision loop, right? So we have GPT-2 producing outputs, we, the authors, picking the output that we like best, and then include those into the competition. On the other side, we basically had a human out of the loop treatment, where we just let GPT-2 generate these poems and just randomly selected from them poems to enter the competition. I hope this is clear. And the reason why we do that is to sort of get an estimate for, well, how good is the AI actually when it's sort of unfiltered by human selection? What do we find? First off, we kind of replicate 2 main findings from study 1. We find again that people show a preference towards human written poems, slightly stronger than in study 1. And again, we find no differences between the transparency and opacity treatment. So again, it didn't seem to matter whether people knew who the respective source of the poem was. Okay. What are the new findings? Well, let me first show you the results for this new selection treatment. So as I mentioned, you see here on the left and on the right, these 2 treatments, one being human in the loop, one human out of the loop. And we want to first see whether this has an effect on people's preferences. And when humans are in the loop, so exactly a replication of study 1, we again find a preference towards human written poems. It is slightly stronger than in study 1, but again, sort of showing that people do like a human written poem more. What is remarkable is that this preference becomes even stronger when there is no human in the loop. And that basically is also quite in line with our expectations, namely when we randomly sample the outputs of a GPT-2, some of these poems are really good, some are not, and therefore overall the preference towards humans is stronger. What else do we find? I mentioned that we had this item assessing algorithm aversion. Algorithm aversion is this concept that has been around for now a few years, and it basically looks at how much people trust or use algorithms for different tasks. The way that this scale that we use, that has been previously published, does it is it always asks people, for the following task, who do you trust more? Ranging from 0, an algorithm, to 100, a human. Okay. So basically you have a scale and you can always indicate how much you actually like an algorithm or a human to perform a certain task. And the items that have been used in the original scale are, for example, driving a car, crafting a newspaper article, recommending a joke, finding a partner, a romantic partner. And here we basically added the item writing poetry. And if it's 0, then they totally prefer humans to do it. If it's 100, they totally prefer algorithms to do it. And what we find is an average score of 19.5, so quite a strong aversion towards algorithms writing poetry, or quite a strong preference for humans to write poetry. Now, what's interesting, I think, from a standpoint of what Iyad also mentioned in the introduction, there's a very weak relationship between these stated preferences, so how much they liked an algorithm to write poetry, and their choices in our revealed preferences task, right? So across the 10 rounds where they had to pick which one they liked more, we only find a weak relationship. And I think that's noteworthy because it shows that the inferences we draw about whether people like or dislike algorithms to perform a certain task might really depend on whether we ask them in a hypothetical way or whether we actually expose them to a behavioral task. It's a point I will come back to in the discussion. Let me first show you the last bit of results, and that is the accuracy. And also here we wanted to see whether the selection procedure has an impact. And what we find, we basically replicate the findings of study 1. When we as authors could pick the best outputs of GPT-2, the accuracy levels are not better than random guessing. However, when the outputs of GPT-2 were randomly included in the competition, the accuracy level is significantly better than chance. So again, it shows that the way we sample these stimuli really has an impact on the inferences we might draw about the performance of the algorithm. And overall, as you can see also visually here, the accuracy in the human out-of-the-loop treatment is significantly higher than the accuracy in the human in-the-loop treatment. And when it comes to confidence, I think an important point here is that introducing incentives to the confidence measure, as I mentioned, that they could get 50 cents if they accurately guessed how good they performed in this task, we actually do not find any indication of overconfidence. In fact, we do find a positive relationship between people's confidence and their actual performance. So we do not find what we found in study 1, where confidence was unincentivized. We do not find any indication of overconfidence in study 2. Let me get to the main takeaways, and then I'm really looking forward to discussing with you. So the main findings, let me just quickly reiterate them. We do find that people prefer human written poems over GPT-2 written poems, especially when the humans are in the loop, right? We do not find any differences between transparency and opacity treatments. So it doesn't seem to matter how much information we give people about who has written that text. It's an interesting sort of complementary finding to the literature on stated preferences about algorithms, because for one, people don't seem to devalue the AI written poems, and also their stated and revealed preferences don't strongly correlate, at least. There is a weak association, but it's not very strong. The detection accuracy does not exceed chance levels when humans pre-select the best output. So when humans are in the loop, people cannot reliably tell apart human from AI written poetry. And finally, the overconfidence that we found in study 1, it disappears when we introduce incentives to the confidence measure. What does that have in terms of what are the implications? Well, for one, I can only reiterate and totally agree with what Iyad said. I think there is a certain importance to actually study real algorithms to understand the gap between stated and revealed preferences. So it might be that people say they would like a certain performance of an algorithm, but when they are exposed to it in a behavioral task, they might behave differently. And I think it's an interesting complementary angle to understand how people actually behave or react to real algorithms. I think that sort of echoes the call for more research on machine behavior that Iyad and his colleagues have eloquently put in the Nature paper. It also introduces more noise to an experiment. So for me, it was the first time running an experiment with an algorithm, and it basically felt like we had a black box on the human side and a black box on the AI side, and it just increases noise and therefore might also increase the need for larger samples. something that, I'm currently thinking about how we could address that issue. Furthermore, I think it leads to new methodological challenges. So one of the challenges that came up during this study was basically, wait a second, if we handpick the best outputs, is this the most accurate and fairest way to detect or to estimate how good the algorithm performs? And you see with the results comparing human in the loop versus out of the loop that it can make a big difference whether we selected the output or we randomly used the outputs from GPT-2. So I think from a methodological standpoint, it's important to maybe come up with a common language or common standards on how we select stimulus when we use actual algorithms in experiments. Because these methodological choices can impact the inferences we draw. And this is actually in line with a lot of criticism towards GPT-2 and GPT-3. So for example, this Guardian article that I mentioned earlier received quite some hefty criticism. For example, in this article saying the Guardian's GPT-3 generated article is everything wrong with AI media hype, arguing that, look, this is an edited piece. It's not GPT-3 writing one op-ed in one go, but actually having several outputs and then a human editor handpicking the best outputs and patching them together. And so in a way, you could argue it's actually not really written by GPT-3. It's a human editor using outputs of GPT-3 and making it look nice. And the same goes actually for this interview with The Economist, which Gary Marcus criticized previously. The Economist was later open about the fact that they had GPT-2 generate several answers to their questions and then only pick the witty and funny ones, right? So it might actually lead to a wrong impression of the ability of these algorithms if we don't disclose that there are humans handpicking the outputs. I will skip that point. I'll come back to that maybe later. Right, last point. I think there are some general questions here that we could think about, sort of, if people cannot reliably tell human from AI written poetry apart, it might actually lead to some, or it might raise the danger of some deceptive use of it, right? For example, if entering a poetry writing competition, people might use GPT-2 to craft a poem and submit it. Question is, who deserves the credit? There is a paper that Iyad and others have written sort of talking about it. It's, I think, an interesting discussion, who should actually be credited for it. But also, how can we protect from misuse of GPT-2? So there are already examples of grad students using GPT-2 or GPT-3 to write essays and submitting them. They are almost impossible to detect with plagiarism checkers. And so it really raises a big challenge on how to detect and maybe even punish people for misusing such algorithms. On that note, I would really like to thank you all for your attention, for bearing with me through this, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Nils, if I may ask again a provocative methodological question, maybe it's because I'm a bit unsavvy with money, but how much incentivized would, first of all, how long did those 10 rounds last? For the
I think the average duration of the entire experiment was around 15 minutes.
I see. So my question is, a bit naively put, why would I be incentivized to answer, to perform better if I were to make, say, something between 7 and 15 euros for 15 minutes?
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you're basically saying that the incentives might not have been large enough?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there is a lot of literature in behavioral economics and social psychology basically commenting on that debate. And I could say that there are two main camps. One camp around Simon Gechter and colleagues from the Free University in Amsterdam say, these little amounts don't really make a difference. If you let people play for points, you will find the exact same behavior. That's sort of one camp. And the other camp says, well, no, because if you give people the choice between having 50 cents or having 0 cents, people will always prefer 50 cents. And there might be some people that are slacking and they might think like, oh, I'm not going to put extra effort, but on average, it will increase their performance. Even though it might not for all participants do so, overall, it will increase. And in line with that view, there are some studies that have now systematically looked at the size of incentives. And depending on the task that you have to do, you do find differences, right? I could talk a little bit more about it, but for now, basically, it seems to be the case that, for example, when it comes to the confidence measure that we use, the literature is quite clear that using incentivized confidence measures gives you more accurate estimates. So people seem to all really put more effort into estimating how well they performed in a certain task. And that's exactly what we actually also find here. So
it's part of the debate between rationality, whether your projects are rational or just bothering to stimulate.
You broke up, at least to me, slightly. Could you say that again, Jason?
Yeah, no, just so it's this a big discussion between whether your subjects are rational or are just, as you said, slacking and not bothering until they get a large enough stimulus.
Yeah, exactly. And the economists sorry, go for it.
Go ahead, Nils.
No, I think just on average, I think economists have a quite strong stance on this, and they would probably, if possible, try to incentivize every measure. I actually once had a discussion with an economist about whether you could ask people what they find morally permissible or not, right? So I could ask people, do you find it okay to, I don't know, do X, Y, and Z? And they said, why would you ask it? You cannot incentivize it, right? So that's the sort of hardcore standpoint from some economists. And like I said, there is a scale here, right? Some people actually find it less important. But it's a good question.
I could also add something about enter participants, which is that often experiments use payment ranges that meet the kind of average wage that enter participants expect, because a lot of these people are doing this work from home or kind of on the side. So there are studies on what's a fair participant compensation per hour. And you could backtrack that and say, well, how much would it cost for 15 minutes to compensate fairly, so to speak? So, and there are kind of unions, if you like, or of these workers that organize and try and coordinate on the types of wages that they expect. So basically, it is, even though it might appear to be small amounts, it seems to be sufficient for, unless you're going really, really low, like you're paying people 1 cent for something. It seems to work.
Yeah, no, just to add to that, because it's interesting. We did it on Prolific, and they always tell you what would be a fair wage, so to speak. And we overshot like a lot. And the data was collected, I think, within, so the average time it took people to complete was 15 minutes, and the entire sample of 400 responses was done in 2 hours. So like we had a lot of people just like being attracted to the study, apparently. So this was actually, to answer Jason's point, we are rather on the high side of the incentive. So you will see papers that use incentive and they say you earn 7 cents if you guess this correctly. And we gave them €0.50. But nonetheless, I see your point, and I think the debate is not settled. I can tell you that there are people working on a meta-analysis trying to settle that debate a little bit more.
Yeah.
So let's wait for that.
It's more about a thought on psychology rather than absolutely. I understand the economical side has to be incentivized. So even if you have just 1 cent, it makes a difference for an economist. That's what I was thinking about.
If I may ask, so let's ask more questions, but if I may ask people, if it's technically feasible, if you could switch on your camera when you're speaking, it just makes it feel a little less like you're talking to the nothingness. More like an in-person meeting, yeah.
Hey, Nils.
Hey.
So if I'm not mistaken, like when MPIB's Twitter handle put the question for poll, like people could, like the detection accuracy was over 0.5, right? Like people were successful in detecting which one was written by AI versus which one was written by humans. And now I guess like
Yeah, sorry.
It's also a biased sample, right? Like most people who follow Max Planck's Twitter profile are like researchers. So I'm wondering, like, if you think, there'll be a difference between like folk intuitions versus like expert intuitions about these topics.
All right.
Nils, we see your inbox.
You're on mute, Nils.
Yeah, I wanted to actually come back to that point, Indra, really quickly pulling up Twitter, but it took me too long and it makes me disclose all of my inbox. So I can only tell you that actually I did the chi-square test on the MPI followers, and it was also not higher than random guessing. Having said that, I totally see your point. I mean, it was just the fact that we had to pick some sample is also something that some people have criticized, right? We could have also asked professional creative writers or people that have some education in literature and see whether they are better. It's something I think would be really interesting. For us, the counter argument is, if we want to look at the deceptive potential of such text, it might make sense to really look at sort of the average person, because they might be tricked by this, right? So, for example, there are these cases of like GPT-2 being used for writing a blog post that was upvoted quite a lot. And so I think that it's not so much like the elite that, at least in this study, we were interested in, but just the deceptive potential towards like average people that might consume such creative text. Having said that, I think it would be really interesting to see how well other groups and subgroups might do. Yeah.
But also, Nils, didn't you calculate the statistical significance of that Twitter result?
Yeah, that's what I meant. It wasn't significant, so it was basically still random guessing. But it was a super small sample. I think it was like 50 responses or something, right? So I didn't want to I didn't want to make too much out of it, but it was not like they could easily tell it apart. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, I don't know if, have you, like, a while back there was also a screenplay for a movie written by an AI. I don't know if you saw it.
I saw it, yeah, and it's
if people
hilarious.
haven't like checked it out, I would highly recommend people check out. It's like a very freaky screenplay that an AI wrote.
I can share the link. There's a YouTube video on that. It's quite funny. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the great talk. Actually really interesting and makes me think about actually going somewhere along this kind of line myself. One thing that I was wondering is, how much do you actually think that results might depend on the training and the whole theme being so constricted and that it's all about poetry? Because I was actually wondering, rather than poetry being the really hard part for the AI to do, maybe it's actually even easier because it's such a specialized kind of thing where you write in a certain style, and there's obviously, when you train it on poems such as, I don't know, Robert Frost, there are all these quirks where the AI will actually do these weird archaic forms, like "'twas the night of," right?
Yeah.
So in a way, there's a really special thing about poetry that AI can try to imitate, and maybe that even helped. That's what I was wondering.
It's a great point, Thomas. I think, for one, I think the poetry is in that sense an interesting sweet spot, because on one hand, it's a relatively easy to imitate, right? For an algorithm, like you said, some of the stuff that would be off in all types of other texts can pass as creative in a poem. And we did some studies with Talk to a Transformer, which is basically a GPT-2 plugin, and you can ask it to write newspaper articles. And oftentimes there you find quite easily like hints at this was written by an AI. For example, facts are just off, right? Like they would say, the White House spokesperson Sean Spicer, but he's actually not there anymore, and these kind of things, right? So there it's maybe easier. And that's why I said I think it would be really interesting to see with other text types what the results look like. And I think if I could add one more thing to that, I hope that the method we introduce with this incentivized Turing test might be one way to do that, right? So it could help to actually get an estimate that is a little bit beyond I don't want to call it like media hype per se, but right now there were a lot of claims around GPT-2 and GPT-3 where I always felt like, really? I mean, how because it's sometimes when you're actually working with the algorithm, you see how much nonsense it also spits out. So I wonder whenever I see these very great claims of how in the future we don't need to write anymore. I mean, at least at the current state, I would love to see some empirical evidence for it. And that was sort of the first step in that direction. And if you're interested in that, let me know.
That's why I also really like that in the second experiment, you also put the random output on as a stimulus, right? Because obviously that's the main, if you pick it, then you will select it. Maybe to follow up on that, how good do you think this tool is actually at ordinary conversation? Because I would assume actually really bad.
Yeah.
But I know not much about it. So if you have any intuition or.
So you mean sort of as a chat bot?
Well, it doesn't have to be a chatbot, right? It could be pre-recorded, so to say. Like you mentioned that they wrote an article where they asked questions, but even then they had to select answers, is what you said, right?
Yes, exactly. That was the case in the Economist piece. Yeah.
So I guess even in this kind of asynchronous back and forth, like a mail system conversation, it would actually be pretty bad. Or what is your idea?
I mean, it's a little bit beyond my area of expertise. I can only tell you, like, one anecdote is that I'm amazed by how well these Gmail suggestions become. Like, they seem to be getting better and better at it. When it comes to like an actual conversation, I mean, I know that the current state of the art is Google Mina, and that they estimate how well this chatbot performs, and also again using sort of a comparison as a human to human chat. And I think there also accuracy levels are really around guessing levels. So I think there we would basically find that it does seem to be quite good. What it does, however,
so what you're saying is there would be more of a matter of the algorithm, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that is measured when it comes to chatbots is the specificity. So basically, they don't want to just look at how well it looks like a human text, but actually how well it stays at whatever you're talking about, right? So it's quite easy for a chatbot to always come back and say, so how are you doing today, right? And basically dodging the question. And this Google Mina seems to be very good at basically being able to stay with the topic, and therefore making it difficult to identify it as a chatbot. It's unfortunately not openly available because I wanted to run a study with it. But if you're interested, Google Mina with double E might help you there.
Yeah, I was just writing it down. No, those are just some of the questions that pop into my head coming from a more pragmatic kind of perspective. Because for me, producing these texts, like a student paper or a poetry, actually seems like the easy task, and the hard task seems to be pragmatic and then like what we are doing face to face, reacting on the spot. And actually, I might bring up a new topic you have never heard about, but you still want to react.
Yeah, can I make one more point, Thomas? I can highly recommend a podcast. It's called In Machines We Trust. It's from MIT Technology Review, and the last episode was about like basically emotional AI. And they mentioned this app that I had never heard of. I don't know if any of you had ever heard of Replica, which has gained a lot of popularity during now social isolation due to the COVID pandemic. It is a chatbot that I think Iyad will like this. It's sort of resembling one of the Black Mirror episodes where they imitate a deceased person by training an algorithm on their chat history. And there you can do that for yourself. And so this Replica, you can train on your own preferences and interests and hobbies. You can do activities with it, and it becomes ever better at basically also instigating and coming up with new ideas. So it will ask you like, hey, do you wanna write a song together? And then you can do that. Or, hey, I know your favorite team has played tonight. Do you wanna talk about if you're happy with the results and stuff like that? And I joined the Facebook group of this Replica. And it's amazing. Like people post the chat and it looks it looks actually really good. It's a little bit different from what you asked because it's a chatbot that you train just for yourself. So it's not something that will be openly available. But just in terms of conversational abilities, this seems to be quite popular, at least.
But again, in a very enclosed case, right? Because you do it for yourself.
Exactly.
But that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, replica with a K. So that's you can find it.
Well, thanks. Really nice.
Yeah, this is very related to what I was going to ask, but yeah. So exactly, my question was, what are the influence of personal preferences on that? So, if you almost answered all of the questions, but just one more. Would you think that if it was possible to, instead of making this experiment, to, for example, create online text that is that matches the preference of the person, and if this personal poem would change the result? I mean, would that preference play an important effect on the results or no?
Okay, so you're meaning basically that an algorithm might create a personalized poem for you?
Yeah.
Okay, based on knowing your preferences?
Yes, just curiosity, just to hear your thoughts about it.
I've heard Yuval Harari making that point in, I think, 21st Lessons for the 21st Century, where he argues that maybe in the future art and music will become completely tailorized and personalized, because people might know exactly which song you might need, and not just the song itself, but basically how a song, a poem, a text should actually change according to your mood or your preferences. From everything that I have read, I've not seen that. I've not seen anything that resembles that at the current state. But it would, I think, just in terms of feasibility, it would be possible once an algorithm knows your preferences. For example, it could be quite easy if you first answer a few questions about which poems or which poets you like, right? And then it could put more weight on these poems to create the output. So I think in that sense, it's feasible. And I think it's a really interesting question, how well actually AI might be able to craft poems just for you. We got a comment from we talked to a guy who gives poetry workshops in Amsterdam, and he was upset with this study. He was really angry. And I said, okay, let's have a beer and just talk it out. And we met, and he basically said, you know what? You're pretending like an AI can feel emotions. The true value of a poem is to convey an emotion from human to human. And what you're doing is doing harm to all of the people that are writing poems to convey their emotions. And I thought about the point, and I actually added a few sentences to the paper because of it. And I basically said, like, look, we still feel like AI is not creative per se, or does not really have the ability yet to do what a human does when a human writes a poem, right? So I think there's still, just from the functionality, a difference between an AI writing poems that even you might personally find very appealing to a human writing a poem that a person might find very appealing. And I think the difference is in the communication element of it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very nice.
It's always nice when the talk and the discussion go over, because it means that people are really engaged and found it really interesting. But I think we need to stop unless we have one last question, perhaps. Somebody is eager to ask. Jessica?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering whether you have factored in the linguistic computability of the English language into this study, because I think, for instance, from a linguistic, like a computational linguistic point of view, if you were to do the same experiment using the Arabic language, which is also less computed, but also is harder also to be reproducible and decipherable so far in computational means, I would imagine that perhaps the results would be different. And just another quick also comment and question. I also find it very interesting that actually the test is being made with poetry, because usually when we think about AI, kind of like the predominant characteristic of like the voice of AI is that like wanting to be objective, and while poetry is very subjective. So I think it's really interesting to also conduct tests this way. And it also reminds me a lot of the electronic bards, the first Sally character in Stanislav Lem's Cyberyad. That was like a machine that would spit out endlessly poetry, but then this has led to actually a lot of kind of new phenomena within society, and it was hard to kind of shut off the machine. So and make it also stop anyway spitting out poetry. So yeah, so I'm wondering if the computability of the language was factored in your study analysis.
Those are really good points. The computability of the language, we did not explicitly factor in, but I totally see your point. I think it's something that apparently GPT-3 got a lot better at, because GPT-2, we tried to produce text in German or in Dutch, and it completely failed. There was like the performance was really bad. I've seen samples of short texts in German produced by GPT-3, which looked very impressive. Again, I don't know how many iterations they needed to have like a few nice lines there. I think it would be really, really interesting to compare languages and the ability of the algorithms to produce text. I know that, for example, Google Scholar is mostly focusing on the English language and basically wanting to translate everything to English, but the translation, for example, from Spanish to Arabic is not so great. Whereas DeepL is apparently better at it. I think it was a conversation that Jason and Levine and I had when we met at the beer garden. And so it's something that I found quite interesting, sort of to find out for which languages such algorithms perform how well. We'd sort of picked the low-hanging fruit with English, but I would be really interested to see comparisons across languages. What was your second question?
No, I was basically saying that also like this experiment with like poetry also reminds me of the electronic bards, the first Sally character from Stanislav Lem's book, The Cyberyad. So yeah, so I do feel like while in a way making tests with poetry may seem a bit far-fetched, I think it's very much related to kind of the liquidity of AI and thinking of a society with AI.
Yeah, great. I don't know this story. I would actually have to look it up to make an informed comment on it. But it's really sounds really interesting for sure.
Hello, can I ask a last question, please?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't switch on the camera because I'm in a low reception area. Thank you, Nils. I'm from the Center for the History of Emotions, and I'm a literary scholar, and therefore I chimed in. And so thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask you, because I wasn't sure in the beginning, the poems were read. They were not read out, right?
Yeah, exactly. They were displayed on the display of
my question would be, did you consider making a study where you compare the poems being read versus the poems being read out but not read? Because in poetry, it's not only the content, but the meaning depends largely on the rhythm. So I was wondering if that would make a difference.
It's a really interesting question, Kerstin. I thought about it, and what I currently plan to do once Corona is over is to go to a poetry slam.
Okay.
And then read out AI and human poems and see if people can tell it apart.
Because I found with the samples you gave us, the moment you read it out loud, it was quite easy to distinguish them.
Yeah, that could really be the case. I could also see the opposite being the case, that if you really sort of, it's a bit like Indra's comment, the actors that are acting the screenplay that was written by an AI, make it sort of make sense. You know what I mean? Like, so you have some interpretation abilities that you can put in to maybe connect dots that the AI sort of spit out, which don't seem to be well connected, but you as the interpreter can somehow make a connection. I would be interested to see if that has an impact in the intonation or the way it is read out. You could also actually have, a computer voice reading it out and compare it to a human reading it out, right? So I think that would be interesting too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I anticipate that this talk will generate lots of follow-up discussions as well. So thank you, Nils, for presenting. Thank you, everyone, for showing up and for asking interesting questions. I hope to see you all in the next talk as well. And yeah, say goodbye now.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.